You're all very welcome for the Lyons Heritage Walk. This is an event in conjunction with Heritage Week. There are about 2,000 events through the country for Heritage Week. It's really important because this is private land. Access isn't available to this. It's a working farm. There are all sorts of health and safety issues. We're very, very grateful to UCD for allowing this group, under the auspices of Ardclough Community Council, to visit the heritage sites on the hill today. There are effectively 3 stops that we will be visiting today. 2 of the stops are very close together: Lyons Church and Lyons Castle. The castle is a bit of a misnomer. All it is the gatehouse. The rest of the castle was destroyed, taken apart. The stones were used for other buildings. It was destroyed in the wars of the 1640s. The church is a lot older, back to about 1200. Surprisingly, in this little area, we have 5 ancient churches. And when you consider the population at the time would have been very small, how could you sustain 5 churches in a small area? Very simply, they all came to prominence at different times. They had different levels of wealth. The earliest would be the 2 that are associated with the 6th, 7th century. One is over in Castledillon. All there is really there is one gravestone from the graveyard, which was on the site of the church. But most prominent is Oughtherard. It has a round tower from around the 10th, 11th century, and a church from the 1350s, which was on the site of an earlier church. 2 saints associated with that site. It is pretty well regarded and in great state of preservation. Probably the wealthiest for a little period of time was Whitechurch. When it came to the 15th and 16th centuries, Whitechurch was very prominent castle and church there. We have 2 churches very close to each other here on the banks of the canal. One of them is in Clontarf. Again, the graveyard is there, the church is gone. That would have been associated with a couple of saints in the 5th, 6th century, and it is from around 1000 AD. Lyons rolls in a little bit later. It was the parish church. And the reason that it's so well adorned is down to the wealth of the family who held this territory for about 500 years. We're meeting them here in the graveyard, the Aylmers. By the standards of around here, which is very, very good land, and you ended up with a lot of confiscations, a very high turnover of landowner. The Aylmer innings was extraordinary. They held the land for 500 years with the exception of about 19 years. Very powerful. One of them, the only one to feature in the Dictionary of National Biography, the Oxford Dictionary and the Dictionary of Irish Biography, famous Gerald Aylmer, a lawyer and effectively enforcer for Henry VIII. He was involved in the confiscations of the monasteries in Ireland. He more or less drew the programme up for that. The very first one to be confiscated was St. Wulston's, best known nowadays as the girls' schools, the girls' secondary school in Celbridge. But the reason is this girls' secondary school started in a house right beside, a couple of fields away from the ancient monastery, which was one of the wealthiest and most powerful. Gerald Aylmer ended up with a lot of wealth himself during the time of Henry VIII. The Aylmers were very pro the Geraldines. They deftly became involved when Silken Thomas organised his rebellion against Dublin Castle. They ended up as one of the prominent families fighting against Silken Thomas. And then in the 1640s, they ended up on the Confederate side. But oddly enough, when King Charles II was restored in 1660, I think through family connections, they'd married into the Butlers of Ormond, they managed to get their lands back. In the 1690s, they fought again in the Battle of the Boyne and were on the losing side there, but got named in the Treaty of Limerick. So they kept their land for a little bit longer. Oddly enough, having survived 500 years of all this strife, it all went pear-shaped when Michael Aylmer inherited the land, the estates, at the age of 3, and we come from County Kildare. We know the dangers of gambling. He ended up losing the whole lot, gambled profusely, according to folklore. He lost the last of his fortune gambling on the colour of the dress of the next woman to walk into the room. He was borrowing heavily from a wool merchant and banker from Wicklow, Nicholas Lawless, and it ended up that the Lawless family got hold of Lyons. They finished the house that he'd started, Lyons House, and they ended up owning the house for the best part of 200 years, and they removed the Aylmer monuments from the graveyard. It's only in recent years that the Aylmers have a monument back to the generations of ancestors who buried here. And the Clontarf family, because they took the name Lord Clontarf, the Lawless family, are buried in the adjoining vault. This is the old castle of Lyons as opposed to the new castle of Lyons. The village of Newcastle, County Dublin, its original name was Newcastle Lyons. The two castles diverged a bit from about the 13th century, and there was some rivalry between them. The Aylmer family in the 1640s would have been pitted against Newcastle, which was controlled by William Parsons at the time. William Parsons ordered Lyons town, which was a considerable town, to be burned and the castle to be burned. All you see is that gatehouse. But think of the gatehouse in Maynooth, which it resembles, and the big castle behind it. The big castle behind at Lyons is now gone. All we have is the church and the churchyard. There are beautiful carvings on the doorway of the church, and they're quite unusual to find in a small country graveyard. But again, this reflects the wealth and the power of the Aylmer family when this was an important church in the 1400s and the 1500s. The props aren't working for me today. This is a sycamore tree, but this is where we'll shelter from the rain for a little minute and hear about the legend of Lyons. The legend of Lyons is as significant as the real reason for its name. The real reason for its name is more prosaic, Lyons, the elm tree. In the 9th and 10th century, that wasn't enough. You really needed a place legend to place yourself among the most important parts of Ireland. Kings of Leinster at the time, the O'Donoghue dynasty, they made sure they were in the Din Seamachus when it was being compiled. It's a beautiful literary work. It tells the story of the King of the Dacia's daughter and how she was forbidden to marry. She ran away with her lover, she was pursued, and she was killed on the spot that is now known as Cnoc-Lewan, or more accurately, She Launa, She, literally the place of the fairies. And keep an eye out, the fairies are watching us here. It was on this spot, according to the Book of Leinster, Agil of Shannorach, that another King of Leinster's son was kidnapped by the fairies. Getting into the Din Seamachus was important. It shows how powerful the kings of Lyons Hill were for about 300 years, from 700 to 1014, and that's a significant date in Irish history. Okay, the top of Lyons Hill, just short of 200 metres, not very high, not even the highest point in Kildare, but very significant because from this point you can see all the way to Roscommon. Have a look around. From our school days we know that Ireland's a bit like a saucer, the mountains on the outside, so you have all this flatness in the middle, and that made Lyons prominent. The most prominent thing you can see here is one of the most recent. It was put up in the 1830s. The Ordnance Survey needed a trigonometrical point from which they could survey and calculate the heights of hills, and you can see Lyons from so far away. It's the first of the foothills of the Wicklow Mountains behind us, that this was where they put the little obelisk. They disturbed a lot of the features here which are of architectural value. The surveyors that came in, Joe Lee, and academic surveyors that have come and had a look, say a lot of what was here was disturbed. And what was here was a royal inauguration site. For about 300 years after the Battle of Ballyshannon down near Athy, Kildare dynasty held the kingship of Leinster. It split in three. There were three competing families, and they managed to divvy out the kingship for about 300 years amongst them. It was an extraordinary feat. Francis John Byrne, the professor of ancient Irish history in UCD, described it as the equivalent of keeping three oranges in the air. It'd be quite unusual for kings to live on the inauguration site, but Lyons would be one of the exceptions to this rule. Mullaghmast, the Murdoch dynasty, they ended up becoming the O'Tooles, and then the O'Faolain were based in Naas. They ended up becoming the O'Byrnes. And here in Lyons we had the O'Donoghue dynasty. They were all part of the Eoghan, which would protect each other's interests, with a couple of notable exceptions. Some interesting characters here, the beautiful names, Finn Sneachta, White Snow, and he was deposed by the High King of Ireland for presumably not paying his tributary, and then was reinstated and then deposed again. And we had Bran, who was possibly one of the first kings in Western Europe to be anointed. Francis John Byrne says this is significant. Some others, like Donnacha Corron, would say that it may be a mistranslation. But it's common now for royal families to be anointed. When the king was crowned in France, he was anointed in Rheims, and one in England would be anointed in Canterbury, and one in Spain would be anointed in Toledo. The very first anointing of a king possibly took place on this hill here. Lyons was at the height of its power in the run-in to the Battle of Clontarf, and may even have contributed to dynastic strife between two of the Idinglaga branches. Morocco Mac Finn was slain treacherously, according to the Annals of Ulster, by Donald Clane, who was the king based in Lyons here at the time. Now, Maelmurra was the son of Morocco, and the daughter of Morocco was Gormla, who became the most powerful woman, extraordinary woman in medieval Ireland. Managed to marry the King of Tara and the King of Dublin, the Viking King of Dublin, and the High King of Ireland. She was married to Brian Boru at the time that her son, by another marriage, Sitric, was among Brian Boru's enemies as Viking King of Dublin. Maelmurra went looking for allies. He found his allies in his nephew, King Sitric of Dublin. Donnacha Clane and his son, Donald MacDonagh, went looking for allies, and they found one in Brian Boru. Two big battles. One of them was fought a couple of fields away from here. It was the Battle of Glenmama. It was in the cusp of the century, the end of 999 AD and New Year's Day 1000 AD. The Vikings and Maelmurra were very seriously defeated in that. 14 years later, we had an action replay. We had Brian Boru and the Ardclough kings on one side. We had Maelmurra of Naas and the Vikings of Dublin on the other side. Who won the battle? Brian Boru was killed. He claimed victory. It's pretty much in all the school books. King Sitric more or less stayed in place. Dublin became a powerful kingdom afterwards. And even though the Ardclough king had been on the winning side, both the Ardclough and the Naas branch lost the kingship. Dermot MacMurrough's great-grandfather brought it to Wexford, and that's where the Kingdom of Leinster had its capital in Ferns until the coming of the Normans. Two of the great legends of Lyons Hill can't be proven, but happily they can't be disproven either. One of them, and it was told by the iconic Ardclough school teacher, Bridget Maguire, is that Cromwell stood on this hill and said, "Ireland is a country worth fighting for." The other one is that the trees were laid out in the formation according to the Battle of Waterloo. It doesn't appear like that from looking at maps, but you can't be absolutely certain that this isn't true. The strong Arthur Guinness connections here, the road west, which the battle troops on the way to, for instance, the siege of Limerick would have passed right by the hill here and on to Uachtarard. And it was on Uachtarard, the hill, that Arthur Guinness's mother's grandfather sold beer to the passing troops. Maybe that's where the beer tradition came from. Arthur Guinness was buried in that graveyard in 1803 because of his mother's family connections here. Daniel O'Connell fought a duel just beyond that, a few fields beyond that. It was just over the County Dublin, County Kildare border, which probably explains the choice of the site. It was also on land that was owned by the Liberal family, the Ponsonbys, who were based in Bishopscourt. O'Connell shot John D'Astaire, who had challenged him to the duel. O'Connell had described the Dublin Corporation as beggarly. D'Astaire responded by challenging him to a duel and died as a result of his injuries. Thanks to everyone for joining us on the hike in the rain here to celebrate Heritage Week 2017, and a special thanks to UCD for allowing us access to the site. We're very, very grateful. So much history under our feet here, and great to see such an interest in it.